Hello everyone, I hope that you all are having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever it is that you're watching this. Within today's lecture, we will be covering Chapter 22 from the Cooper, Huron, and Hewer textbook, the 3rd edition, which is on shaping. The 6th edition BCABA TCO items that we will be covering in this lecture will be coming from the Behavior Change Procedures section, which is Section G, and we will be focusing on G8, G9, and G13, which say that you will learn to develop and implement shaping procedures, chaining procedures, as well as develop and implement acquisition procedures that are appropriate to the client's skills and intervention goals. For example, discrete trial, free operant, and naturalistic teaching arrangements. For this last TCO item, we will cover the topics briefly, but you'll see more on G13 in an upcoming lecture in one of the future weeks of this course. Okay, so let's get started with talking about shaping. Shaping is a technique that we use in behavior analysis in order to teach different organisms some form of behavior, right? It can be a simple behavior, it can be a complex behavior. But the idea is really that the behavior in its terminal form does not yet exist, but maybe we have this complex skill that we want to teach this organism, whether it's a human, an animal, whatever it is, right? We have a complex skill that we want to teach them, but how do we get from point A to point B? Well, the way that we do this is through using shaping. And what we do basically is we break down this very complex skill into very small and digestible steps, or very small and digestible responses. Or target behaviors. And so I have some like a more technical definition for you guys on the next slide, but let me highlight for you guys a few examples of very complex behaviors that have been taught to animals specifically that I feel are very impressive and are a great example of the use of shaping. So shaping has been used to teach health-related behaviors to different animals. So for example, let's say that you go to a zoo and you see different animals in the enclosures. There are specific medications that those animals need administered to them. There are specific personal care activities that they need to engage in, whether it be trimming their nails. In this particular picture up here, there's an elephant getting an elephant pedicure. That's actually what it's called, and it's pretty impressive. If you guys want to watch a video, I put it down here for you all. But this is a picture from Busch Gardens. If you go to Busch Gardens, you can see the animal trainers and teaching these elephants very distinct skills, very complex skills. It's not like they're walking over to the elephant and saying to the elephant, "Hey, elephant, I need to give you an elephant pedicure. Please put your foot through this gate." That's not how that happened. Obviously, the elephant, is not cognitively aware enough to be able to discriminate that verbal SD and be able to engage in that particular response. This skill of putting their foot through the door and keeping their foot there in order to get an elephant pedicure has been taught through the process of shaping. Okay, so I'm going to go over what shaping looks like for you guys in a second, but I'm going to show you guys other behaviors that have been taught through the process of shaping that I think are quite impressive. Shaping has been used to teach security type behaviors and to teach safety type behaviors. So teaching dogs to sniff explosives, to sniff for explosives and identify where there are explosives or even drugs, right? This is a skill that has also been taught through shaping. These dogs were not just born knowing how to identify these particular substances. These are skills that had to be shaped over time. They started off with smaller behaviors, smaller approximations to what they really wanted the animals to do. And then over time, they were able to shape up that particular skill. And in this particular picture, I have a picture of a diabetic alert dog. There are also seizure alert dogs. These are dogs that can pick up on cues that can alert a human to, them having a diabetic episode, or them possibly having a seizure soon, or they might be having some seizure activity. And so they can pick up on some of these cues and can then have their human engage in particular behaviors to keep them safe. I really think it's quite impressive. And of course, shaping is not only used with animals. I highlighted examples of where shaping has been used with animals, because I think it highlights the power of a technique such as this, because you cannot simply go to an animal and tell them, hey, and sniff, go find some explosives for me in this airport. They're not going to do anything. They won't be responsive to that verbal statement. But you can technically do this with some humans, right? You can tell some humans, you can provide instructions, and some humans are able to engage in responses based off of those instructions that you provide, and some are not, right? So that might be a skill that you have to teach. But we as humans also acquire skills through shaping, and especially we use these skills when we are working with people with developmental disabilities, because they might not naturally have specific skills that we're trying to teach them. But like I mentioned, the complexity of the types of skills that we're teaching are really, really evident when we are looking at examples of animals. So what is shaping and what does it involve? Shaping is the differential reinforcement of successive approximations towards a terminal behavior. And in very simple language, this pretty much means that with shaping, you are reinforcing specific small steps towards a terminal behavior. So imagine the behavior of the dog learning to sniff for explosives. They might start off with having the dog, discriminate between an explosive smell and maybe a smell of a treat or something. Eventually that behavior gets reinforced, but once that behavior is already occurring consistently and the dog is able to identify the explosive and discriminate between the explosive and other smells, maybe then they go on to pick a different behavior, and by different behavior, I mean a slightly more advanced behavior that's closer to the goal that they are trying to achieve. So eventually, the dog is no longer reinforced for just simply discriminating between the explosive smell and other smells. Maybe now they hide the explosive somewhere, and the dog is taught to find the explosive under a cup, let's say. And I'm just making this up. I really don't know how this particular skill is taught. But I'm coming up with some steps that are getting closer to that target behavior. Until eventually the dog can find the explosive under different items, right? We can teach it to identify explosive under different items, and then we can gradually increase the distance between where those explosives are. So maybe we start off at, let's see if, okay, now he can find the explosives under different items. It's hiding under a cup, it's hiding in a Ziploc bag, it's hiding, in a container. Well, now can he find the explosives that are hiding in different items, but at a larger distance? So now can he do it at a 3-foot distance? And then once he's able to engage in that particular behavior and we reinforce that, we start to push for a greater approximation. Can he now do it at a 5-foot distance? Can then, after he's able to achieve the 5-foot distance, can he do it at a 10-foot distance? And can he pick up trails of smells? So essentially what we do is over time, right? Once the dog acquires a particular skill and that particular skill has been reinforced, we move on to the next step in the ladder. And we don't want to reinforce the previous behavior anymore. We want to only provide reinforcement for the more advanced behavior that we're trying to teach. So this is why it says shaping is the differential reinforcement of successive approximations toward a terminal behavior. That's because we are using differential reinforcement. We are reinforcing the successive approximation. But then once this response is occurring consistently, we move on to a more advanced response, and we no longer provide reinforcement for this particular response until eventually we go up the ladder and they are able to engage in that terminal goal, that terminal behavior, or that target behavior, however you choose to phrase it. Okay, so the process of shaping is a 3-part process. So this is what you would do as an assistant behavior analyst. You are going to, number 1, detect a change in the learner's environment. So first you're going to see, well, what behavior can they engage in? Okay, and once you determine that behavior that they can engage in, you're going to make a judgment. You're going to see, okay, well, is this behavior an approximation of this target behavior that I want to teach? So let's say that the behavior that you want to teach is, I don't know, a child to say the word apple. And let's say that the child can say p, and that's it. They can make the p sound, and that's it, the p sound. Well, that's an approximation. It's close, but it's not quite the word apple. So we need to detect the change in the learner's environment, right? What response can they engage in? We can reinforce that. And then we want to see, well, okay, once I've reinforced this particular behavior, they can engage in the p sound. Can we push them a little bit further? What other sounds can they make? So we no longer reinforce the p sound, the p sound. We push them to see, well, what can they engage in now? And we are essentially putting the behavior on extinction. The p is no longer going to receive reinforcement, and we're going to see, well, what can they do now? And that's where we're going to detect the change in the learner's environment. Okay, and the child can't say apple, but guess what? He can say app, just the a and the p sound. So we're going to make a judgment. We're going to make a discriminated judgment about whether that change is a progressively closer approximation to a terminal behavior of interest. So is app a closer approximation to apple than the sound p? And the answer is yes. App sounds a lot more like apple than just p. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to differentially reinforce that closer successive approximation. I'm going to go ahead, deliver reinforcement for that sound of app. And then what's going to happen is once that response is occurring consistently, I'm going to go ahead and push for a greater response. Now I'm no longer going to reinforce the sound app, because app is not my target response that I'm looking for. I'm going to go ahead and push a little bit further, and I'm going to see, well, what sound can they engage in now? And maybe they say apapa. Okay, apapa sounds a little bit more like apple than app, right? It's not perfect. It still is an added syllable. It's not the correct syllable, but it's a little bit closer to our target word. And this is all going to vary by learner. This is going to look different for every single learner. Each time you're trying to teach a skill, the steps or the successive approximations are going to look different for each learner that you are working with. Okay, so we go ahead and we reinforce apapa. And then eventually we make it to a point where that behavior is occurring, and we stop reinforcing that. So we place that on extinction, and we are then going to only reinforce a greater approximation. So we're going to ask ourselves, the learner is going to engage in a different response. Maybe it's apple. Okay, that's even closer. So we're going to reinforce that, and we're no longer going to reinforce the previous behavior until eventually we teach them to say the full word apple. And once they say the full word apple, we are no longer going to reinforce any previous approximation. We're only going to reinforce that particular response. This is an example of shaping. So we reinforce the closer successive approximation, and we place the previously omitted behavior on extinction. So let's talk about why shaping works. Like I mentioned to you, you're going to use differential reinforcement to reinforce the slightly better successive approximation, right? And then you're going to place the other behavior on extinction. So when you reinforce a response that meets certain qualities or dimensions that you are looking for in a behavior, and you place behaviors that do not meet those criteria on extinction, we are running differential reinforcement. And differential reinforcement works because of that extinction component. We need to use that extinction component. The extinction component in differential reinforcement is causing what is called extinction-induced variability. Okay, and if you recall, extinction is when you are no longer reinforcing a behavior. And what happens is when you no longer reinforce a behavior, the person is like, well, why? Not just the person, but the organism is like, well, I previously contacted reinforcement by engaging in this behavior, but I'm no longer receiving reinforcement for engaging in this behavior. So what other behavior do I need to engage in? And this is where that extinction-induced variability comes into play. So they start engaging in different behaviors and novel behaviors that are part of the same response class. And so what happens is that's where we are able to find our next successive approximation. That's how we are able to find the slightly closer response to what we're looking for. So let's look at this example. This is an example that's provided in your textbook. I think it's a great example. And if you review the PowerPoint from this chapter on the textbook, you're going to find a really good visual on this as well. But this is how to use an incentive spirometer. If you've never come into contact with one of these, this is provided sometimes when you've had like a pneumonia, I don't know, for different lung diseases, doctors will provide this, and it's a little device. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know, the exact reasons for it, but it's a little device that you blow into, and you have to blow at up to like a certain capacity in order for you to, I'm assuming it's like a type of therapy. I'm assuming it's to receive the benefit of this therapy or this exercise that they're asking you to do. So it's actually, I've tried blowing into one of these before. My grandfather has used it before, and he had to reach a specific criteria as well. And I tried blowing into it, and it was very difficult for me to reach that specific criteria that he was trying to reach. So what happens is when a person is provided with these barometers, that response that they're looking for, that terminal behavior, has to be shaped up. It's not something that a person can automatically do, but it is beneficial for a person to be able to use their lungs in this capacity. And so this skill has to be shaped up. So let's say, for example, that Johnny needs to use his spirometer, and he has a target goal of reaching 1,750 ml. Okay, so this is his target goal here. But when he blows for the first time in the spirometer, he can only reach 250 ml. So that's great. That's his baseline. We know now where he was at to begin with. Now let's see if we can get him up to 1,750 ml. So he blows into the spirometer a second time, and he's able to hit 275. So if we were to use shaping, you would literally be with him, and you would say, "That's great, you got it. 275, keep pushing. You're getting closer." Then he blows in it again, and he only gets to 270, and you say, "Oh, not quite. Try what you did last time." So he tries what he did last time, and he's able to reach 277, which is slightly closer than our this attempt that we had here. And so we go ahead and we reinforce that. Notice how with this one we delivered extinction. No reinforcement was delivered. Extinction was the procedure that we implemented instead. Okay, so this is that differential reinforcement aspect. This successive approximation here was already occurred. That was reinforced. Now this is no longer good enough. We need something greater. We need a greater successive approximation, and that's what we're going to reinforce. So that's why at this step, we did not provide reinforcement. Okay, so 277, he blows on the fourth attempt, he blows, and he can reach 277 ml. So that response is reinforced. Then he tries again, and he blows into the spirometer, and he can reach 489 ml. So that's reinforced. Attempt number 6, again, he blows in and he reaches the exact same point, 489 ml. So that's not quite better. So we're just going to place that on extinction. We say to him, "Oh, you can do better. Let's keep going. Push, push, push." And he blows in there again, and he gets 805 ml. And so we provide reinforcement. You say, "You're doing great, Johnny. Keep it up. You're getting there," and so on. So you continue to do this using the process of differential reinforcement, or the procedure of differential reinforcement, where you reinforce the greater successive approximations until eventually Johnny can reach 1,750 ml. Okay, and just like in this example, this is how we teach different complex skills. Let's look at another example of how shaping can be used in order to teach an individual to draw a straight line, a horizontal line across a paper. So In this particular example, they use the little stars on the paper to denote like the appropriate approximations. So when you see a star on a paper, those were the responses that received reinforcement. If they don't have a star on them, then they didn't receive reinforcement for that particular response. So they're trying to teach, this is a terminal behavior, and each of these are the different successive approximations that are going to be receiving reinforcement. So let's talk about what the particular steps are. So in step 1, they're going to only reinforce the longer scribbles. If there's like a small scribble, it's a little hard to see, and I hope that if you're looking at this on a big screen, then you can see this well enough. But if there is a small scribble or like a small circle kind of like this, then they're not reinforcing that, but the longer ones, then those are receiving reinforcement. Okay, so you'll see that the longer scribbles have little stars in them, all of the shorter ones do not. Okay, this is an example, a very clear example of differential reinforcement here. So these that do not have little stars in them are contacting extinction. What's going to happen is when they increase to the next successive approximation, which is that they have to have longer uncrossed scribbles, those responses will be reinforced. So the longer uncrossed scribbles will be reinforced and the other ones will not. Again, this behavior is no longer good enough. Just a long scribble alone is no longer going to cut it. That's not going to receive reinforcement. It has to be a long but uncrossed scribble that is going to be, those are the ones that are going to receive reinforcement. So if we look here, for example, this one is long, but it does cross. So this one is not going to contact reinforcement, but this long one over here that is not crossed does receive reinforcement. Now, again, progressively, the requirement is going to increase. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have gone to number 2 first. So it should have been longer scribbles that do not cross. And then it went to longer uncrossed scribbles that are greater than 45 degrees. Then it goes over to this one down here. They're only going to reinforce longer horizontally oriented lines. So as long as they are slightly horizontally oriented and they don't cross, then those will receive reinforcement. If you look, these are kind of going diagonally, and so they don't receive reinforcement, but the ones that appear to be going horizontally are receiving reinforcement, okay? Now it's going to progress over to the step 5. So the 5th successive approximation is going to be, they're only going to be reinforcing longer horizontal lines within a criterion tolerance for parallelism. That's a little bit complicated, but basically they're just trying to reinforce only the lines that are long and that are horizontal and appear to be closer to being parallel. Okay, so these don't meet that particular criteria. They're not particularly horizontal. They are slightly increasing, but all of these other ones did receive the reinforcement. Okay, and then eventually they only reinforce the terminal behavior. So after this particular step, only the terminal behavior will receive reinforcement. So only those that are perfectly horizontal are going to result in them receiving little stars. So the skill of writing is taught really similarly to how this example here is shown. When you are teaching an individual to write, you begin with tracing. And with tracing, they don't initially need to trace within the lines. Smaller kids are allowed to trace outside of the lines, and that is reinforced. Eventually, you only reinforce them tracing within the lines, and then eventually perfectly following along with the line. Until eventually you don't provide the lines any longer. Maybe you only provide the dots in the paper that designate where to begin the letter and where to finish the letter, until finally they can just copy letters and then just write letters from memory. That would probably be the terminal response that you would be looking for when teaching somebody to write. But this process of learning to write is also taught through shaping, and this doesn't happen overnight. This takes, this happens across months, maybe like a year. For some kids, it happens in a few years. So the process of shaping is not something that has to happen very quickly. Even something like this in this example, this example here, depending on the learner, could have all been within a day, but it's very likely that it wasn't within a day. It's very likely that these responses were shaped over time until eventually they were able to engage in the terminal behavior. So behavior can be shaped across many different dimensions as long as that dimension can be modified or shaped in any particular way. So this table here, which is taken from your textbook, provides the different dimensions that we can modify for particular behaviors. And sometimes we're not only modifying one dimension, there are times where we want to modify multiple dimensions of a particular behavior. But we, of course, want to break things down and work dimension by dimension. We don't want to make the behavior that the person has to engage in or the organism has to engage in too complex or too complicated. The idea with shaping is that you want to break down the behavior into such small and achievable steps that it'll make the learning easy. Okay, until eventually we can build up to that point where they can engage in that complex skill. If you guys think about your jobs that you engage in, everyone has different careers, but when you're doing on-the-job training, a lot of your on-the-job training involves shaping of particular skills, so that eventually you can do all of engage in all of your job duties. But to begin with, you're not provided with every single one of your duties to complete. Those are skills that are shaped over time. A manager doesn't become a manager overnight. A manager becomes a manager because specific skills have been shaped in their repertoire across several years. So anyways, let's go back to talking about the different dimensions that we can shape behavior across, okay? The first dimension is topography. So we can modify the form of a particular behavior. For example, I can modify the grip of a child holding a pencil. So if you have ever seen a small child holding a pencil, they might hold it by grabbing it with all four fingers. And you might want to modify their grip. So that is you modifying the topography of their particular response. I might also want to modify the magnitude of their response. So if a child is gripping the pencil incorrectly, I can modify the topography, but I might also want to modify the magnitude if they're not pressing hard enough onto the paper, right? Maybe they're not applying enough strength or force when they're writing, so I might also want to modify that particular dimension of the behavior. So I can possibly modify the topography and also modify the strength with which they're writing. I wouldn't do both of those at the same time. I would probably focus on topography first, and then I would eventually move into teaching them how to hold their pencil a little bit tighter and push down on the paper a little bit harder. But I'm just trying to give you examples of different dimensions that we can work on. You can also work on modifying the rate of a behavior. So if you have a behavior that is occurring too frequently, or if you have a behavior that is occurring too infrequently, then you can modify those and shape up those behaviors or shape down those particular behaviors. So as a part of the requirement for this class, I have you guys do SAFMENT. And for SAFMENT, I have a terminal goal for you guys. Let's say that the terminal goal is 30 cards that you're supposed to be able to recite in 1 minute. Well, that is not something that I'm expecting you all to be able to do overnight. This is a skill that needs to be shaped across the entire semester. So you might begin with only being able to get through 2 cards in 1 minute, but eventually you might be able to get through 5 cards in 1 minute, and then 6 cards in 1 minute, and then 10 cards in 1 minute, until gradually you increase to the point where you can engage in the 30 cards in 1 minute. Respond correctly to 30 cards in 1 minute. We can also shape the latency to respond. So I have an example of this. I have a client that I used to work with several years ago, and he was very intelligent, but when you would ask him a question, or when you were engaging in a conversation with him, it would always take him about a minute to respond. And if you think about how long 1 minute is, it's a really, really, really long time, and it's going to make it very difficult for him to have relationships with peers or with adults even, when it's taking so long for him to respond. So one of the target skills that we were teaching him, or the target behaviors that we were working on, was to reduce the latency to responding. He doesn't have to respond as quick as we respond, but 1 minute was excessive and would be very damaging to his relationships with peers and with other people. And so teaching him to respond a little bit quicker, being more fluent in his responses, was one of the goals that we worked on. You can also work on increasing or decreasing the duration of a behavior, and we can also increase or decrease the inter-response time between behaviors. This is, again, another behavior that I've worked on, increasing the inter-response time between number of the bites, food bites taken. When you have a learner that you're working with that eats too fast, and you have a risk of maybe them choking, or maybe they're consuming more food than they should be consuming, whatever the rationale may be, then we can work on increasing the inter-response time so that they are eating a little bit slower and taking more time between their bites. We could also, I like this example here, and this is not something that I've done personally, but it's a great example of other applications of EAB. So we can increase the inter-response time in order to reduce smoking. So maybe maybe a person is smoking you know what? People use vapes now. People that use vapes smoke very, very often in comparison to cigarettes. Maybe you're smoking your vape, I don't know, every 30 seconds. So there's an inter-response time of 30 seconds in between those, and maybe you want to increase that inter-response time gradually so that eventually you're only smoking every 30 minutes. So that's also an example of another dimension that we can modify. And then lastly, we can also modify or try to shape up or shape down the magnitude of a particular response. And magnitude refers to the strength of the form of a response. So some examples of this that we might use, in traditional ABA applications might be to increase the voice volume of one of our learners. So if you have a learner that only whispers, that would work possibly in a one-to-one setting, but in a setting where there's more going on and you can't really hear the learner, if they were to whisper, those vocalizations, that verbal behavior that they're engaging in won't be reinforced, or is less likely to be reinforced if the listener can't hear what they're saying, right? So we might sometimes work on increasing the voice volume of our learners just so that they're more likely to have their responses reinforced. Another possible application where, we might use shaping of the magnitude of a response to reach like a desired terminal behavior. It might be like, I'm thinking, in people that play sports, maybe you have somebody that's playing baseball and they're batting too softly, and you want to increase the force of their response. Well, then we can use shaping by teaching the person to successively hit a little bit harder, and we would reinforce each time that they hit the ball harder. So that's another example where we could see shaping in use. And actually it's used, we do see shaping used commonly in sports, where there are behavior analysts that apply behavior analytic principles within sports. And so often the topographies that they may be shaping might involve, a more forceful response than what the client was originally engaging in. So as I just mentioned, we can shape behavior across the different dimensions of performance. And this means that behavior can be shaped within specific response topographies. If you recall, a topography is a form of the behavior. So shaping within a response topography is when the form of the behavior remains exactly the same, it remains constant, but instead we're differentially reinforcing some other dimension of the behavior. So we're shaping, like the inter-response time, we're shaping where the magnitude, right? All of those different examples that I gave you in the previous slide, those are examples of shaping behavior within response topography. So the form of the behavior remains the same, but instead we're trying to, let's say, increase voice volume or increase the force or, reduce the duration of something, etc. All of those are examples of shaping behavior within a response topography, but we can also shape behavior across response topographies. So this would include some of those more complex behaviors like the ones I mentioned earlier with the dogs, sniffing for explosives, or the elephant being able to do the elephant pedicure, right? It requires them approaching the fence. It requires them lifting their leg, putting the leg through a hole, staying there for a specific duration. All of those are different response topographies that are shaped, and those response topographies are all part of different response classes. So when we're shaping a particular behavior that we're shaping across response topographies, basically that means that we have different response classes that are required as successive approximations, right? There's some behavior, some component within a response class that we need to reinforce, but it's not good enough. It's not getting us to that terminal behavior, and so we have to continue to shape across different response classes until we reach the desired behavior. There's a particular skill that I thought of that I think involves response. I think is a great example of shaping across different response topographies, and that was the behavior of singing. Initially when you're learning to sing, you might just you don't work on singing on its own. You might work on other response classes, on behaviors that are within other response classes, such as warm-up exercises or breathing management, like having control over your breath, or, where exactly are you supposed to breathe, how exactly are you supposed to breathe, etc. Then you might work on vocal tone. Each of these things that I'm mentioning are behaviors. Like, for example, all of the behaviors within a warm-up exercising might have similar response topographies or might have dissimilar, different response topographies. But every single one of these is a different response class, okay? And to be able to engage in the behavior of singing, you should have mastered all of the behaviors within these different response classes. So obviously singing is a very complex behavior, that needs to be shaped up over time, and you should master every single one of these, prerequisite skills, you could call them, to be able to sing. And the way that we master these different skills is through differential reinforcement. As we are practicing those skills, you learn, right, which particular approximation, you learn through successive approximations to engage in some of these more complex forms of behavior. So in this particular slide, this is not a video, it's just like a video. I'm sorry, it doesn't have any audio, it's just a little video. But if you click on this link here, then you'll be able to see this video. And I think it's a very short, but quick and great example of shaping across response topographies. You'll see that the girl initially sings a very short verse, and she doesn't sing it very well. And it's, her voice cracks in the clip, and then the instructor modifies the way that she's opening her mouth. You'll see that she pulls down her mouth a little bit. That's you modifying, or her modifying, the response topography. She's showing her a different topography that she can engage in. She also provides some vocal prompts of how she can continue to successively improve her performance. And so in a very short clip, you'll be able to see shaping, the process of shaping occur. So you can go ahead and click this here, and you'll be able to watch the video. So why is using shaping a beneficial intervention, right? What are the benefits of it? Well, with shaping, we are focusing primarily on reinforcing behavior. Sure, it does incorporate extinction, but we are primarily reinforcing behavior. And so we can maintain, positive interactions with our learners, and we are able to avoid the use of aversive contingencies to teach behavior. So it really is just typically a positive experience for our learners. It may take some time. It's not like shaping of behaviors is going to always be very quick. Sometimes we have learners that acquire a particular skill very quickly, and then we have other learners that will take more time to learn a particular skill. But generally speaking, these are very positive interventions, and you won't get many, I guess, side effects from implementing a shaping intervention. Also, we can combine shaping with other established behavior change or behavior building procedures, such as vocal prompts, just as you saw in the video on the previous slide. The instructor initially used some physical prompting, but she also used some vocal prompts to guide the learner through how to engage in that particular response topography that she was trying to get the learner to engage in. So by combining shaping, right, the differential reinforcement procedures of successful approximations, by combining that with some of those other behavior change procedures that we know to be effective, we can produce very behavior change in a very effective manner and in a positive manner. We could also combine it with chaining, which you'll learn a little bit about chaining shortly. Okay, so although there are many benefits to using shaping, there are some limitations, of course. There are at least 5 limitations of shaping that can be identified. The first is that shaping new behavior can be time consuming. So as I mentioned, sometimes we shape a behavior and very quickly the learner acquires that particular skill. But in many cases, when we are shaping a behavior, we might spend quite a bit of time teaching one particular step of that behavior, right? Or in that ladder. One of those successive approximations might take some more time to be mastered. And so it's very important that when we are working on a shaping program, we've very clearly defined, what the target behavior is, and we can decide, what that next successive approximation that we are looking for is going to be, and that we are monitoring progress towards that terminal behavior. It's also important to keep in mind that progress towards the terminal behavior is not always going to be linear. So that's the second limitation of shaping, is that we might have in mind the plan for shaping, right? We have those steps that we would like to see, but you might have learners that might jump steps, okay? And so you have to be willing to modify your intervention based off of where that learner is, or meeting that learner where that new successive approximation is. So for example, when teaching a vocal approximation for apple, like I mentioned earlier, the learner might only be able to say p, and you might expect the next approximation to be app, but instead that learner goes and they say apd, okay? And so when you see that, yes, it's a closer approximation, and it might not be the one that you expected, but it is a closer approximation, and so we have to be willing to modify our intervention, to individualize our interventions to our specific learner's needs. Then third limitation is that shaping requires continuous monitoring to detect subtle changes in the learner's performance, indicating the next approximation to the terminal behavior. So this kind of goes hand in hand with what I just mentioned. It's not just that you are going to run a shaping procedure and you're going to do it all willy-nilly with no particular steps or guide in mind. This is something systematic, as is everything within behavior analysis. You're going to be systematic and methodical about the particular steps that you will be following, right? Although I did express that you can be flexible in order to individualize your specific program to your client's needs. But you need to always make sure that you are monitoring the program to make sure that your learner is making progress towards the goal. And when they have mastered a particular step, that you are pushing for that next approximation, whatever that next approximation may look like. Limitation number 4, I would say, is probably one of the bigger ones that we want to look out for, which is that shaping can be misapplied. Okay, so just as, and I'll talk about number 5 also, which is that harmful behavior can be shaped. So I'll talk about those together. So shaping can be misapplied is referring to when we are teaching a particular skill and then we inadvertently reinforce maybe an undesirable dimension of that particular behavior, or when we inadvertently reinforce a particular topography of a behavior that we were not maybe won't help us get to the terminal behavior, or that is actually just considered a form of problem behavior. So a very easy and common example is that when we're teaching, our clients to communicate, sometimes, we might teach them to communicate using a full sentence, saying like, I don't know, I want any want that they want. I want cereal. And a caregiver might be busy and may not hear the client. So what happens is, if the child says, I want cereal, and the caregiver didn't hear them, the next time that the learner says, I want cereal, it's probably going to be a little bit louder. And then the parent might still not hear them, or they might be busy doing something else, so they haven't responded. So what ends up happening is the learner starts to increase their voice volume and increase their level of aggression when they're saying, and they might, and to the point where they say, I want cereal, and they might yell it out. Maybe they have like some like, other emotional reactions attached to the phrase. And so that's when the caregiver hears them, or that's when the caregiver responds. And so in that particular example that I just gave you guys, that's an example of shaping an inappropriate or a maladaptive behavior. We've just shaped up screaming, or we've just shaped up, like a more emotional response from a client, or from, like in this case, the caregiver shaped up an emotional response and a problematic behavior such as screaming in their child, because they didn't respond to them the first few times that the child communicated something at an appropriate voice volume. And so, what essentially was occurring there is they place that behavior on extinction, the appropriate vocalization at a pretty normal voice volume. They placed it on extinction, right? Inadvertently. The caregiver probably didn't know that they were placing it on extinction. And then instead they reinforced the topography of the behavior that was being yelled, where they were yelling and they were, maybe like holding their fists together, whatever other emotional response was accompanying that behavior. This is an example of where shaping can be misapplied, where we can accidentally shape up behaviors that we don't want to see. Another example of this is, like a real world example of this is when you go to a vending machine, and your vending machine, you insert the money, you put food in the vending machine, and then the vending machine does not provide you with the food. And so you start engaging in other novel behaviors to get the food out. You start pressing the buttons, you start knocking on the window. That doesn't work until maybe eventually you're like kicking the vending machine, and that still doesn't work. And then maybe finally you are grabbing the vending machine and moving it from side to side, and finally that works and gets your food out. That's an example of shaping. So the next time that you come across a similar situation, you put money into a vending machine, the vending machine doesn't give you food, you're probably going to skip all those other steps, and you're going to go straight to shaking the vending machine, because that's what's been reinforced in the past. And the other topographies of behavior have been placed on extinction. You didn't get any results from those last time, so you're more likely to resort to that more severe form of behavior, which is shaking the vending machine. This also applies to aggression. So we see this often, with aggression, where certain topographies of behavior, more severe topographies of behavior, are shaped up, because those are the ones that result in gaining attention. Maybe when a child hits their sibling, and they're pulling their hair, that's when they get attention. But maybe they didn't get attention when they were, from the caregiver, I mean. Maybe they didn't get attention from the caregiver when they were calmly speaking to their sibling, when they were calmly speaking to the caregiver. Instead, the caregiver is only giving them attention when they're engaging in these severe forms of problem behavior. And so what happens is the child learns, well, I want to get attention from my caregiver. But my caregiver is not giving me attention when I'm speaking to them calmly. They're not giving me attention when I'm playing nicely with my sibling. They're only giving me attention when I'm aggressing towards my sibling. And so if I want to get attention in the future, I'm going to aggress towards my sibling. And this all is a result of shaping, because over time, that's the response that has resulted in that learner, that child getting attention. So shaping can be misapplied, and it's something that we have to be very cautious and aware of when we are working with our therapists, when we ourselves are implementing an intervention, when we're working with caregivers or teachers. We want to let them know, like you can be inadvertently shaping undesirable topographies of behavior because we're not reinforcing those desirable topographies of behavior. So we have to be very cautious. And then lastly, another limitation of shaping is that harmful behaviors can be shaped. And like I just mentioned in those previous examples, that goes hand in hand. That's an example of harmful behavior being shaped. But also some concerns, I'm sure you've heard of people's concerns with video games and maybe young children not being exposed to video games at a young age, or children not being exposed to video games at a young age. I think that's what I meant to say. But one of the rationales for that can be that, the behaviors that they're observing in the video games can potentially be shaped in real life. And so that's one of the concerns with video games. Your textbook also provides another example, which is that when you are posting on social media, you get validation through social media in the form of likes, right? We receive, for most people that post on social media, they're posting to get, to share with their audience, to get likes. Likes can be considered or seen as a form of reinforcement. And so by obtaining reinforcement for behaviors that you're posting on social media, you might post something one day that's a little bit riskier and get even like a bigger reaction from your audience, get more likes, get more views, whatever it might be. What might end up happening is social media, right, by getting you more attention for those riskier behaviors, might even be shaping up riskier behavior in the future. So if you want to, get views and likes in the future, you might move into engaging in more risky behavior and posting it on social media in order to get those views and those likes. And we see this often. We see this often when we're scrolling through social media. There are people that post things online. You're like, oh my goodness, why would you post this? Or why would you do this? Well, that's probably why those behaviors have been shaped over time, because those are the behaviors that are resulting in more likes, more views, etc. Now let's talk about clicker training, which some people may know as tag teach. But clicker training is the term that you'll hear most commonly. And I don't think you'll see the term tag teach in your textbook, but it is a term that you'll find in the literature, and it's a term that is, or a procedure that is most often used with humans, and it's often used in sports. Whereas clicker training we commonly see being used with animals and animal training. So clicker training or tag teach are it's a way to shape behavior, but we use a specific clicker, which a clicker is like a handheld device that produces an audible click when you press on the button. I have a little image here for you all. Basically, what we do is with clicker training or with tag teach, what we do is we condition this click as a reinforcer through pairing the click with a reinforcer, an already established reinforcer. So basically what you do is you press the click when the learner engages in a desirable behavior. You press the click, and then you pair that with, let's say if you're using treats, then you use a treat. If it's human, then you can pair the click with praise or some other established reinforcer. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to run the same procedures that you would when you are running a shaping procedure, except that the reinforcer that you're delivering is a clicker. And the benefit of using a clicker is that you can more immediately deliver that reinforcer for more discrete responses, for tinier responses that are harder to pinpoint. So basically, as soon as the response occurs, you're able to deliver the reinforcer, and then the learner knows exactly what response is being reinforced, because the response to reinforcement delay is reduced, right? We're able to provide that reinforcer at a temporarily more closer time to when the behavior occurred. So that behavior is more likely to then be reinforced. that particular response. I have some videos on the next slide that'll demonstrate this procedure with humans and with dogs. As I mentioned, with humans, it was very difficult actually to find any videos on YouTube when I typed in clicker training. Typically, most of the videos that would come out were dog videos or animal videos. I saw some rat videos. I saw some cats, some horses, right? So it was all animals that would come out. But the same exact procedure with humans was referred to as tag teach. When we are seeing the tag teach videos, you'll see the term tag point being discussed. The term tag point is just a term that is used during tag teach to refer to a successive approximation. So one of the things that they do with obviously with an animal, you cannot necessarily tell them what specific behavior you want from them in order to reinforce that behavior. With the human, you can. So with humans, we have something that is referred to as a tag point, and it's just that successive approximation that you're looking to reinforce. So we can vocally tell them, here's the response that's going to result in reinforcement. So this is what I'm looking for. And then they'll attempt to engage in the response. Once they attempt to engage in the response, if they do engage in the correct response, they'll receive reinforcement. And if they don't, they weren't quite able to meet that the criteria, then they won't hear the click. Tag teach is used often in, I won't say often, but there's research on its application in sports. And the reason that it's used in sports is because let's say that somebody is engaging in a complex dance routine, right, where it's difficult to provide reinforcement in the moment. Well, one thing that you can do is when they are in the air, attempting a dance move, if they hit the criteria for that particular step that you're working on, you're able to just click, and that dancer knows right away that's the response that I need to engage in. You're able to reinforce the response immediately. Whereas alternatively, if we simply wait to deliver feedback after the dance routine has ended, the feedback is so delayed. So this way, with tag teach, we're able to, and just clicker training also, we're able to deliver reinforcement more immediately. And so the person is able to, get that feedback right away and then change or modify their behavior to match the feedback that they've received. So on the next slide, I have some videos that you can click through and watch. One of them, the first video on this slide, is going to show you how to establish the click as a conditioned reinforcer, which should be review for you all since you've already covered, how to establish, how to get a neutral stimulus and make it into a conditioned reinforcer through pairing. So that video will demonstrate how to establish the click as a conditioned reinforcer. The second video you can click through and you'll see a rat that's being taught to go through a tunnel. They're using shaping, but the reinforcer that they're delivering is a clicker. So it's clicker training. And then finally, the last video, you'll see the golf skills being taught through tag teach, and they are using shaping as well. But in this particular video, you'll see them teaching a specific response, so which they refer to as the tag point. You'll see the instructor telling them exactly what their tag point is, and then he will go in and he'll practice that particular skill, and then you'll see when she reinforces and does not reinforce particular topographies of the behavior. Now let's talk about some guidelines for shaping. First, we'll discuss how you can decide whether a shaping procedure is appropriate for your learner or not. The first thing that your textbook says that you should do is to assess the terminal behavior and the resources that are available to you. So you want to ask yourself, what will the terminal behavior look like? What exactly are you working toward? And this is something that you would want to clearly define, write down, have a proper measurement system for others to collect data, and make sure that you're monitoring progress toward that specific goal. Then you can ask yourself also, what support do you have from staff or caregivers in order to implement and consistently reinforce the specific target response that's being worked at in the moment? And also, how will you collect data? Like I mentioned, how are you going to monitor progress with that specific step? And then also, how are you going to be able to ensure that you're all working and communicating appropriately to make sure that you're all targeting the correct step and not, one person is working on one particular step of the shaping procedure and another person is, working on a different step. Instead, you all need to communicate what specific step has been mastered and that you can ensure you're differentially reinforcing the appropriate step. So number 2, you want to assess whether time constraints or staff issues or lack of resources are, in place. And if you do have any of these concerns, then you should consider whether the use of shaping is an appropriate procedure or not for your client. And then one final consideration is that some behaviors will seem to be not appropriate or may not be a well-suited behavior for a shaping procedure. And this may be due to the complexity of the behavior, or maybe there are some ethical concerns, maybe the behavior is a more severe behavior, etc. So something that we see sometimes is that we want to target a particular behavior. So for example, let's say that I want to target teaching a client to engage in specific speech sounds, or teaching them to speak using words, right? Like let's say I want to shape specific words in their repertoire, but that learner might not have any, might not be making any vocalizations at all. So if a learner is not making any vocalizations, they don't necessarily have those prerequisite skills in order for me to even shape up specific sounds or words, right? They're not making any vocalization, so how can I reinforce that initial step, right? The first step would be, maybe saying a specific sound, but they're not even engaging in any of those sounds. They don't make sounds at all. So if I have a learner that's not engaging in any vocalizations, then they don't necessarily meet the requirements for a shaping procedure. Instead, I would need to focus on first just getting them to engage in vocalizations in their repertoire, establishing that that response as a consistent response in their repertoire through, reinforcement, pairing those sounds with reinforcement. And then once they're consistently engaging in vocalizations, then I can consider a shaping protocol for making specific, saying specific words or making specific speech sounds. Otherwise, that wouldn't necessarily be an appropriate intervention. Something else that we can see or that we might encounter is that there are behaviors that are too severe where it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to implement a shaping procedure. So there might be some behaviors where I've mentioned that we target the reduction of a specific dimension of the behavior. So let's say that I have a behavior like throwing of objects where I can reduce the number of times that they throw. That could be like a specific dimension that I target, and I just focus on gradual reduction, shaping down the severity of the behavior. But that's not a very severe behavior, or for most learners, it might not be a very severe behavior. But for a client, let's say that engages in a very severe form of behavior, like let's say headbanging, a shaping procedure where I were to allow them to continue to engage in that behavior and I just focus on reduction of some dimension of that behavior, let's say the magnitude or the frequency or whatever it may be, or maybe I try to modify the topography of the behavior, that poses more risk to the client, because every single time that they engage in behavior in that particular response of head hitting is, it's a situation where we're exposing them to have a traumatic brain injury. So the risk of engaging in head hitting is so much higher than a behavior like, let's say, throwing of objects that might not be, it can be a risky behavior, but it's not as risky as something like head hitting, where each instance that they engage in the behavior poses a high risk for that client. And so in those instances, a shaping procedure would not be an appropriate procedure. Instead, we would maybe want to use differential reinforcement. There are other procedures that we would consider before considering shaping procedures. So as I mentioned, these are the guidelines that you want to, these are some factors that you want to consider prior to determining whether a shaping procedure is appropriate or not for your client. But let's say that you have already decided, okay, my client fits these specific requirements. We don't have any concerns about a severe problem behavior or anything like that. We have the resources. I know exactly what the terminal behavior is. The terminal behavior seems that like it's one that's achievable. They already engage in some capacity, they engage in a successive approximation to the behavior, so we think it's a feasible intervention. So once you think it is a feasible intervention, then you'll go through these next steps that are going to be outlined in the next few slides. So they are called the modern principles of shaping, and these are principles that will assist the practitioner in implementing shaping in applied settings. So let's go over some of those different steps. So step 1 says that we should be prepared before we start. And what this means is that you should be ready with your items that are necessary for reinforcing that particular behavior that you're targeting. So if you're using a clicker because you're doing clicker training, then you should have your clicker ready to go. You should have any reinforcers that you're providing ready to go. And you should be able to deliver all of those different reinforcers or the click immediately. So when and by the way, as I mentioned, when you're using clicker training, you should have already paired that clicker as a reinforcer. So that's really the first step. But once it's been paired as a reinforcer, it's been established as a conditioned reinforcer, then you're ready to get started with shaping if you're doing clicker training. If you're not, then you're probably just providing some reinforcer, whatever it is for the client that you're working with. But you should be delivering it immediately as soon as the target response occurs. Okay, so I'm not talking about that terminal behavior. I'm not talking about the final behavior that you are hoping to see. I'm talking about at each immediate step, you want to make sure you're ready to deliver reinforcement. And then also, you have to be very attentive to every behavior that your learner is engaging in. Okay, this is something that requires like high quality attention. Make sure that you are looking at the learner and that you're looking at everything that they do, because any small approximation that's getting them closer to that goal, you should be reinforcing it immediately. Okay, step 2 is that ensure success at each step. So you want to break down behavior into small enough pieces that the learner will always have a realistic chance to earn a reinforcer. You don't want to make it difficult to attain the reinforcer. You want to make it achievable. Okay, so every time you're selecting your steps, make sure that they're small and they're getting you closer to your goal, but that they're achievable for the learner. Step 3 says, train one criterion at a time. There are many things that we want to work on, and sometimes we want to, work on modifying the topography and also changing some dimension of the behavior, but we're going to do each of those things one step at a time. An example that I can give you of this is I work on teaching my clients independent work, to work independently. So we work on what we call an independent work program. And sometimes this looks like me sitting right next to the learner and teaching them to just sit and complete one question at a time. So if they're successful with completing one question only, I give them the reinforcer. Then this looks like me getting them to complete 2 questions at a time, maybe then a half a worksheet. And each time that they're able to meet that target, I provide reinforcement. Eventually, I want them to be able to work on one complete worksheet. And the whole time, I've just been sitting next to them. But they've been working on their own. I've been teaching them prerequisite skills, such as, asking for help if they need help, asking for a break. I've taught them all those different advocacy skills, but they're at the point where now they can complete one entire worksheet with me sitting right next to them. Okay? Once I've gotten them to that point, what I work on next, I don't want them to work only when I'm next to them. I want them to be able to work when I'm walking around the room, when I'm out of the room. But to get to that point, it takes preparation. Okay, so now that they've mastered being able to complete a full worksheet, I'm gonna work on that other dimension of behavior that I wanted to work on, which was increasing my distance so that they can work independently when I'm outside of the room. So I'll start with sitting behind them. I'm right next to them still. I'm really close to them still. I'm in close proximity, but I'm sitting behind them so they can't see me anymore. And then maybe I'll sit once they've mastered that and they've completed one worksheet with me sitting behind them, then I'll work on 2 feet behind them or 2 feet away from them, and then maybe 3 feet, and then maybe 5 feet, until eventually I'm just walking around the room and delivering reinforcement occasionally, intermittently. And so that's an example of me shaping up the behavior of working independently. And if I would have looked at this skill from the beginning, right, from when I first started working with this learner and I assessed their skills, I always knew that I wanted them to be able to complete a whole entire worksheet, and that I also wanted them to work without me sitting next to them. But as you see in number 3, I needed to focus on training one criterion at a time. I knew I wanted to modify the distance, and I wanted to modify the or shape up the amount of work that they can tolerate. So I focused on increasing the amount of work they can tolerate first, shaping that up first. Once that was strengthened within their repertoire, then I went ahead and I worked on increasing the distance, okay, that they could tolerate being away from me. So that's just an example of how we would focus on one criterion at a time. There's going to be many ways that you will want to modify a behavior. Think about how you can break down that behavior into very achievable steps so that that learner doesn't even realize that it's difficult for them. We want to make it so easy for them that they're like, I can do this. And they'll contact reinforcement so quickly, so easily that they'll feel motivated. And they'll continue to modify their behaviors to access that reinforcer. But each time we're getting them a little bit closer to where we want them to be. We're just doing it in a way that's achievable for them. Yeah. So, okay, number 4. Number 4 says relax criteria when something changes. So there will be times when you're running a shaping protocol and you notice, you know what, this step is really difficult for them. They might not be fully ready to work on this yet, and you might say, let me take a step back. So let's say that I moved too quickly into something that, let's use the same example of the independent work. Let's say that they're tolerating the whole entire worksheet very well, and now I want to start increasing my distance from them, but I realize that they're not fully ready yet to work on the entire worksheet by themselves yet. Maybe there's some other prerequisite skill that I need to teach them. Maybe like I said, asking for help is a skill that I usually like to teach in combination with an independent work protocol. So maybe there's something else that I need to work on to strengthen within their repertoire first, before I'm ready to move on. So whenever necessary, we want to relax criteria so that we're making sure that whatever we're working on is still achievable for that learner. Because something that can be very detrimental to a shaping protocol would be to advance to a step that's too difficult for that learner, because then they're not going to contact reinforcement. Instead, they're going to be contacting extinction. And we don't want to extinguish all the progress that we've made, right? There have been several successive approximations to get us to where we are. And if they're not able to contact reinforcement to get to that next step, what we are only implementing then is just extinction. And we have to be very cautious, because we know that with extinction, our behavior might eventually go down to 0, okay, if they don't contact that reinforcement quick enough. So that's why I'm saying, whenever necessary, go back to the previous step, reinforce that, make sure it's very strengthened in their repertoire, and then, you can go ahead and try to find maybe a smaller successive approximation to move into the next step. So in the example that I gave you guys, maybe instead of moving, maybe the distance that I mentioned where I sit right behind them, I could stay at that step for a little bit longer, make sure that they're able to tolerate me not being right next to them, and then I can gradually fade out the support that I'm providing. Okay, so number 5 then says, if one door closes, find another. Shaping procedures will not always be perfect. You will have a plan in your head, as I mentioned previously. You're going to have a plan for some steps, but it should be more than like a solid plan, or like a very specific set in stone plan. It should be more of like a fluid guide. Okay, this is, I'm gonna guide my shaping procedure, but it might look slightly different. Okay, you have to be flexible with your steps. So if something in a particular shaping procedure is not progressing, you need to try another way. Is there another way that I can achieve that same terminal behavior by maybe modifying those successive approximations a little bit? Okay, remember, in behavior analysis, everything should be individualized to your learner. So what works for one learner and what has worked for you really consistently in the past with other learners may not necessarily work for your current client that you're working with. And so be flexible, modify your interventions as needed for that particular client that you're working with, and then you'll see progress. Okay, and this also, this, I think number 5 highlights the need for continuous progress monitoring when you are running a shaping procedure. I mean, progress monitoring is important for any procedure that you are implementing within behavior analysis, but when you're shaping any type of behavior, I would say it's even more important, because if you're not realizing that your learner is not making progress with the particular step, like I mentioned, they are not likely to be contacting reinforcement. And if they're not contacting reinforcement, you will probably be placing that behavior on extinction, and then you have a different problem that you're dealing with, because now you might have to start from, an even lower step. Okay, so we don't want that. So just be flexible, modify your steps that you're working on if needed. Okay, so number 6. Number 6 applies, I would say, mostly to animal training. Which we use very similar procedures, or the same procedures that we use with animals, right? They're behavioral principles, so they apply to any organism, right? But number 6 is written for animals. I think these entire steps, the modern principles of shaping, were written specifically for animals, but a lot of the same steps apply to humans. Just obviously some of them should be tailored, I think. So this particular step, keep training sessions continuous, can be relevant, but I think this is mostly relevant for animal training. So it says the animal should be continuously engaged in the learning process throughout the session. He should be working the entire time, except for the moment he's consuming or enjoying his reinforcer. This also means keeping a high rate of reinforcement. Okay, this may apply to your intervention and may not apply to your intervention. If you're using that naturalistic teaching approach where you are just, embedding the shaping into your client's day-to-day life, this won't be relevant. But if you are only running a shaping procedure and you're doing it in a very contrived or controlled manner, then maybe this would apply. But again, this is written specific to animals. Some of them will apply to humans, some of them will not. Okay. So step 7 says go back to kindergarten if necessary. And this is what I just mentioned previously. So if a behavior deteriorates, quickly revisit the last successful approximation or 2 so that the animal can easily earn reinforcers. Okay, and this has to do with what I've mentioned. So remember, when you are running a shaping procedure, we are implementing differential reinforcement. And differential reinforcement involves reinforcing one behavior and placing all previous other behaviors on extinction. So, if they're not accessing the reinforcers, like I mentioned earlier, then their behaviors are being placed on extinction. So do this sooner rather than later. Very quickly. It says it here. Quickly revisit the last successful approximation or 2 so that they can access reinforcers. Okay, and then keep your attention on the learner. Interrupting a training session, can often cause learners to lose momentum and get frustrated by the lack of information. If you need to take a break, give the animal a goodbye present, such as a small handful of treats. Okay, this will look different for your clients, right? But the same applies. If you're working with a client, make sure that you are paying attention to everything that they're doing in that. Like when you're shaping a particular behavior, make sure that you're paying attention to everything that they're doing. Just in general, in a session, you shouldn't be on your phone. You should be paying attention to your clients that you're working with. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Number 9 says, stay ahead of your learner. So be prepared to skip ahead in your shaping plan if your learner makes a sudden leap. I mentioned, be flexible. Be flexible with your steps. It's okay to have a plan in mind, but you need to be flexible and individualize things so that you're meeting your client where they are in that given moment. And then quit while you're ahead. End each session with something the learner finds reinforcing. If possible, end a session on a strong behavioral response. But at any rate, try to end with your learner still eager to go on. This actually is a great tip and does not only apply to a shaping procedure, just in general. I mean, it's great for shaping too. You always want to be able to reinforce at the end of the session and end the session on a positive note. But just in general, this is something that you should try to do with your learners. Don't ever end a session, or don't you usually try not to end a session with your client just engaging in problem behavior. You know, you're supposed to leave at 3:00 and it's 3:00 and you're like, okay, bye. And then you just left the client engaging in a full-blown tantrum. Whenever possible, you want to end the session on a positive note, with that client eager to continue, because that will establish you as a reinforcer. It'll pair you as a reinforcer, and that learner is going to look forward to continuing to engage with you in future sessions. Also, it's just positive for the client, right? It's like you're leaving with them happy. Yeah. Okay, so throughout today's presentation, I've talked a lot about the terminal behavior. We've, loosely talked about how to select the terminal behavior, but let's talk about this a little bit more in depth. So when you are working with a particular client, there will be different behaviors that you may want to target for shaping, within a shaping intervention. You might look at behaviors that are targeted for increase, and you might look at behaviors that are targeted for reduction, okay? So we can shape up appropriate behaviors, and we can also shape down inappropriate behaviors. So practitioners often work with learners having multiple challenging behaviors. We need to identify the highest priority behavior to change as quickly as possible. And we've, briefly discussed how to select problem behaviors to target. But when you are working with a client, we usually want to try to create like a list of priority. And because there's sometimes are so many things that we want to target, we can't target everything at once. So whatever is you consider to be the highest priority, that's what you want to focus on. And then the way that you're going to set the target behavior is you're going to look into the future and think, well, what would we want this client to be able to work on, right? So the problem behavior is, let's say, throwing, right? I mentioned the response, the behavior of throwing earlier. Let's say the behavior of throwing, well, what would I want this behavior to look like in the future? Well, in the future, I want this client to be able to throw, but in an appropriate context, not in an inappropriate context. I don't want them throwing random objects in the room, potentially hitting other people with those random objects. I would like to see the learner, throwing into a ball into a basketball hoop, throwing trash into a trash can. I don't know. Throwing an object in an appropriate context, usually within sports, in a playful context, etc. And then how can I also shape that behavior? How can I shape that behavior to get to that point? That's what we're going to focus on. So there, I've already identified my terminal behavior. My terminal behavior is that I want this person to still engage in throwing, just in an appropriate context. And I would very clearly define exactly what that means. I would say, I want throwing to occur, but, when they're playing basketball, when they're throwing trash into the trash can, when they're playing catch with a friend, etc. And then I would come up with the steps for how to shape that behavior. So anytime that we are going to be working on determining the target behavior, we also want to make sure that we are very clearly defining what that behavior is going to look like. Okay, so actually, let me go back to the previous point. The ultimate criterion is going to be what the individual's expected independence is after an intervention. Okay, so basically, we have to think about, what would I want this client to be doing in the future, right? What do I want to shape this behavior into? And then that's what you'll use to guide the terminal behavior. That's what you're going to select as your terminal behavior, okay? And then we're going to clearly define that. By defining the behavior, that's when we'll know, that's how we'll determine the steps to work towards, and that's how we'll also be able to determine when that goal has been met. You also, when you're defining a behavior, you want to define what does not constitute the behavior. So what does not meet the criteria for that particular terminal behavior. So if they're still throwing objects in a classroom at their peers, or maybe it's not at their peers, but they're just throwing objects down the stairs, etc., then that would not be an appropriate form of the behavior, and that means that we haven't met the goal. So you have to very clearly define everything, and think bigger picture. Where do I want this behavior to go? Where would I want, what specific behavior would I want this client to engage in? And that's how you're going to select the terminal behavior. So after you very clearly define your behavior, you want to make sure that you're just determining what the criterion is for success. So how often do you want that behavior to be occurring? With what intensity, with what magnitude, etc. do you want that behavior occurring in? And how often also. Once you've set that specific criteria, then we know that the behavior has been mastered. Some things that you can do in order to determine the criteria for success is to look at how your client is performing in comparison to their peers. And that will help guide, number one, your selection of the target of the terminal behavior, and it'll also help you to guide the criterion for success. So a very good example of this is sitting. Let's say that I want to shape up a client's behavior of sitting during circle time. Well, I might want to look at their peers to see how long can this client's peers sit during circle time. So I might, in my classroom, in the client's classroom, I might sit and observe another peer's behaviors. I might track the duration for how long they're sitting, and let's say that their peers can consistently sit for around 5 minutes, and then after 5 minutes they all get squirmy. Well, then that's fine. Then that's the same criteria that I'm going to set for my client, because I don't want my client to have a criteria that goes above what's typical for his or her groups of peers, right? We want to set things that are developmentally appropriate for that learner, and we can determine that sometimes by just watching what other people are doing. We can also look at established norms in the literature. We can look at what's developmentally appropriate. And there's just information that we can gather from assessments sometimes to help guide, what we can expect from a client or a learner at a specific age range. Okay, so now that you have determined what the terminal behavior is and you're getting ready to get started with your shaping procedure, you want to make sure that you have assessed what skills that learner has in their repertoire. Okay, where exactly, let's say that there is a range of behaviors that a person can engage in prior to meeting that specific behavior that you want to work on. Where do they fall within that range? So with the example that I gave you about independent work, I want my client to be able to work independently. I want them to be able to complete an entire worksheet and work when I'm out of the room. Well, I need to think where within that range of prerequisite skills or skills that they can engage in prior to meeting this terminal behavior, where do they fall? And that's how I'm gonna be able to basically figure out where that behavioral gap is. So it says, first, having established the terminal behavior, it is important to ascertain the behavioral gap between the current level of behavior and the desired target behavior. Because by figuring out what the gap is, then I can figure out where my first step is going to be. Where do we start? That's how you determine, by assessing the response repertoire. And then it says, second, assessing the response repertoire may help to project the successive approximations that might be emitted in the shaping sequence. As I've mentioned, you need to be flexible. You're going to have some idea of what the successive approximations may be, but your client might give different responses. Okay, the relevant approximations across or within a response repertoire can be analyzed in several ways. So a practitioner can consult with experts in the field to determine their views on the proper sequence of approximations for a given behavior. Normative data from published studies may be used to provide an estimate of the approximations involved. a digital recording can be used to analyze the component behavior. So what this means, I've already mentioned these two in the previous slide, but what this means, a digital recording can be used to analyze the component behaviors, means that you can actually go and observe, like someone else engaging in the behavior. For example, you can watch another behavior analyst engage in the behavior. You can watch a peer engage in the behavior. Or you can go on YouTube and look up videos of somebody engaging in the behavior. And by observing how someone engages in the behavior, we can then think about, well, what are the steps needed to be able to, get to that terminal response that I'm looking for. Then you can help come up with the successive approximations, the potential successive approximations that you would want to work on. And then finally, the practitioner can perform the target behavior themselves. Oops, I just mentioned this one. Themselves, carefully noting the discrete behavioral components as he produces them, okay? So you yourself can carry out that behavior and then think, okay, well, what do I do? What should I expect my learner to do? And I think this is a great suggestion, not just for shaping, but for anything in general. When we're setting expectations for our clients or our learners, we should really be considering, like, how do I engage in this behavior? And what prerequisite skills do I have? Do I need to be able to engage in this behavior? Or we can look at a peer's behavior. What prerequisite skills did they need to be able to engage in that behavior? So let's say it's the behavior of, completing a task at the table. What were the prerequisite skills necessary there? They had to be able to sit. They had to be able to hold a pencil, whatever it might be. By observing other people, we can get an idea for what the expectations can be for our learners. We want to make sure that we are assessing. I think this is something personal that I like to do. I like to assess what advocacy skills a person requires for a particular skill. So if I'm teaching somebody to engage in a task, I want to make sure, let's say that it's completing work at the table, I want to make sure that when I'm shaping that response, I'm also shaping up responses related to advocacy skills. Okay, so I'm teaching, as I mentioned, teaching that learner to ask for help, to request a break. Maybe they can learn to say, this is too difficult for me, or can you break it down for me, or I'm not understanding. All of those different advocacy skills that I as an adult have, that many adults also have, or many kids have, I want to make sure that my clients are also able to engage in those behaviors. So when I'm doing this, when I'm observing a recording, or I'm observing a peer, or I'm practicing a skill myself to get a sense for how the behavior should look, I'm not just looking at the topographies or the dimensions of the behavior, but I'm also thinking about the prerequisite skills. What do I want to teach alongside with this behavior so that my client can be most successful with engaging in this particular skill, and so that they can be successful with, adequately requesting escape if needed, rather than engaging in or resorting to engaging in problem behavior. So those are some things that you can think about. I've already mentioned this on a slide briefly earlier, but I want to make sure I cover it again. So whenever you are getting started with any shaping procedure, you want to make sure that you are detecting even the smallest, movement, or the smallest progress towards the goal that we're working towards. And the moment that you see a slight improvement in that response, you want to make sure that you are immediately delivering reinforcement. Okay. And as I mentioned, tag, teach, or clicker training can really help to reinforce those responses. We're getting, maybe it's like a response chain, and you need to wait for the entire chain to happen in order to reinforce the learner's response. If you feel that the delay to reinforcement is too great, then you might want to consider something like clicker training or tag, teach in order to be able to more efficiently deliver reinforcement. But we always want to make sure that reinforcement is delivered as closely as possible to when the specific response occurs, even if it's a very tiny approximation towards that behavior, but it's an improvement of some sort. Okay, this next one says that we should work on eliminating interfering or extraneous stimuli. This basically means that when we're working with a learner on a shaping procedure, as much as possible, we want to try to limit distractions during that shaping procedure so that we are able to The learner will first of all be more focused and will probably see more progress towards the goal. And you also won't have competing contingencies, right? There's not going to be nothing else in the environment competing for that learner's behavior, right? There aren't any very high or potent reinforcers in the environment that learner is trying to access. Instead, they're focused on you, they're focused on the intervention, and you can see more progress toward your goal. This is not always possible. So sometimes we'll be working in environments where there are competing contingencies, there are extraneous variables. There's a sibling playing with a highly preferred item. So as much as possible, we try to mitigate those things, and try to set up an environment where the learner is going to be more conducive for learning for the learner. But if that's not possible, it's okay. Just do your best to try to set up an environment for them where they will still be able to access reinforcement and you don't have as many competing contingencies available. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into, how do we know that we're at the appropriate level? How long do I stay at this level for? How do I know when I'm supposed to move on, etc.? Okay, so it is equally important to ensure that progress is not impeded by offering too many trials at a given approximation. What this means is that we want to make sure that we are offering reinforcement for a particular successive approximation, just enough for that behavior to be established in the learner's repertoire, but we don't want to stay at that step for too long, because if we do stay at that step for too long, then what will happen is that particular response or that behavior might become too firmly established, which means that yes, it's established in the learner's repertoire, but now that's the only response that they're engaging in. They're no longer engaging in these novel behaviors that will allow us to shape up the next response. Because we've delivered reinforcement for that behavior too heavily and too often, we didn't move on quickly enough. And so now that learner is only engaging in that response, they're no longer engaging in novel behavior. And so by not engaging in novel behavior, we're not able to reinforce the next successive approximation. So yes, we want to stay at a specific step long enough for it to be established in the sense that that it's achievable for the learner, that we know that they can produce it again, but not too long, so that it's not firmly established, okay? And then in general, if the learner is progressing steadily, you want to reinforce it, and then maybe move on. But if they are they're progressing and you see that they're progressing with difficulty, then you want to stay at a specific step for a little bit longer, but not too long, okay? It's like a fine balance. If numerous mistakes are being made or a behavior ceases altogether, the criterion for reinforcement has been raised too quickly. I talked about this earlier, okay? This is where if you have a step that's too difficult to achieve and that person is not accessing reinforcement, you are risking that behavior being placed on extinction, and then the behavior stops occurring altogether. This simply means that the criterion for reinforcement was raised too quickly, and then that behavior was not achievable for that client. It was too difficult. The criterion that you set was too difficult, meaning that you probably should have chosen a smaller successive approximation, and then that learner probably would have been able to access reinforcement, and then you could have continued up the ladder. But because the criterion was too strict or too high, the learner wasn't able to access reinforcement and they stopped responding altogether. So when this happens to you, go back a few steps, reinforce that response consistently again, and then you can go start gradually increasing up the ladder again. So if performance stabilizes at a certain level, the pace of shaping is too slow. I mentioned this in when we were talking about this one. This one. Okay, so now you've reinforced all the different successive approximations. You've made wonderful progress. Now you've reached the terminal behavior. You've reached that criterion, meaning that the behavior is occurring within the specific topography that you selected, within the specific dimension that you wanted, at the frequency or at the rate or whatever it might be that you had previously selected for the behavior to occur. now it's occurring consistently. Well, I mean, now it's occurring, right? You finally got it to occur one time. Well, what do we do so that that behavior can be established in that person's repertoire and that it maintains over time? Well, we do what we always do within behavior analysis, is that we make sure we consistently reinforce, okay, that behavior. We want to reinforce on a continuous schedule initially. And then you guys should have learned about schedules of reinforcement in your introductory course. So you want to make sure that you are continuously reinforcing the behavior initially. Once the behavior is established in the repertoire, you'll go ahead and you'll move into an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. You can also make sure that the behavior is being generalized to other environments, to different people, different contexts, etc. And this is how you will get that behavior to be established in the learner's repertoire. Now, what happens if you don't do all of that, right? The behavior finally occurs one time, it occurs 2 times, and then you're like, okay, the behavior meant mastery, and we can move on to a different goal. Well, what happens in that case? If you stop working on the particular goal, the behavior won't be reinforced. It won't contact reinforcement, meaning that the behavior is going to be placed on extinction. Okay, if it's no longer being reinforced, you're not contriving opportunities for the behavior to occur, not contacting reinforcement, the behavior is no longer going to occur in the learner's repertoire, meaning that you made all this progress and then you didn't follow up with any generalization or any maintenance. You didn't make sure that the behavior was established in the learner's repertoire, and you didn't make sure that you created some plan for maintenance. So you need to make sure that you are, following through with some form of maintenance, some form of generalization, that you're considering the schedule of reinforcement when you finally achieve that terminal behavior.